This is Chapter 9 on the American presidency. First question, what are the two most important roles or functions of the president? Well, let me just give you the list of roles of the president. You can decide what you think is the most important. The first is Chief of State, and that means the ceremonial head of the government. So what the president does is appears at ceremonies, like I guess the classic example would be any holiday. Christmas, the president lights a Christmas tree. Thanksgiving, the president receives live turkeys from the Turkey Growers Association. Probably the most famous general picture of the president as chief of state is laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Um, that's a classic example of the president, and at ceremonies, and ceremonies are almost always at holiday times. That's the best way to think of it. Another a classic example, and again it violates what I just said about holidays, is throwing out the first pitch at baseball season. Usually if there's a team in Washington D.C., the president is invited to throw out the first pitch, or if the president has done something significant, invited to other cities, I should say, to do the same. The second thing is commander-in-chief. As commander-in-chief, the president is the head of the military, and that certainly is a very powerful position where, according to the Constitution, Congress is able to declare war, but the president makes war or carries it out, administers the war. So, starting a war is basically what happens now. The president's in charge as commander-in-chief, thanks to presidents taking action for many years. The president is now pretty much on his own when it comes to being the head of the military. So he has all kinds of roles here as head of the military, starting war, appointing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, picking whoever's going to be the Secretary of Defense, all of that kind of stuff, which really is involved in war making. You can go back to President Lincoln during the Civil War, a war in which the North almost lost. He was not only appointing all the people who were engaged in the war and discussing strategy, but he was making strategy, deciding where to put troops and all of that kind of thing. Okay, next one is chief diplomat. This is where the president would be kind of the opposite role of commander-in-chief. This is where the president would negotiate treaties and agreements and that kind of thing. Like recently, President Obama just negotiated a treaty agreement with Iran, and it has to go before the Congress. The Senate has to approve it, but that was his job. To peacefully, a diplomat is to peacefully settle disputes and problems without having to use military. The third, or fourth, I should say, is chief executive, and that means that the president is the primary leader of the bureaucracy. He's the head of or boss of all the thousands of people working in Washington, D.C. for the national government, and everybody working for that same branch of government throughout the United States. So he's responsible for what happens in the bureaucracy. There's no way, the bureaucracy is so big, there's no way that he can really know what's going on. But he delegates that power to the executive heads, like the cabinet members. But when something happens wrong, and something goes wrong, like during Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, and the kind of fiasco of FEMA, in like, for example, providing temporary housing to the people who lost their homes, and all that temporary housing had to be removed because it was contaminated by chemicals. The president's blamed for that. He's blamed directly and indirectly. So that's a big job. Being chief executive is certainly a big job, and that's the job basically that describes the presidency in the Constitution. Chief legislator means that the president has a role of proposing legislation. And that's pretty important too. He has an agenda. Usually the president comes to power with an agenda from things he talked about during the campaign, and then he tries to implement those things by proposing them to Congress. Usually there's something big in that whole category. Like, for example, when President Clinton was first elected, he brought medical reform to the table and appointed his wife as the main person who was going to lead the charge. It never really happened, but that was their goal, that was their attempt at legislation. The next one is head of his political party. Like it or not, the president is, because he's such in a powerful position, has to be spokesperson for the party. And usually what that means is that he does at least two things. One is whatever positions he takes, whether it's on war or on domestic things, that becomes the position of the party. And the second thing that he does, and this is probably more important, is he goes around and appears at fundraising dinners for members of the party, and he's able, usually as long as he's popular, he's able to raise a considerable amount of money. As a matter of fact, when the president goes around and talks at a rubber chicken dinner or spaghetti dinner or whatever it is, they generally will get raise about $1 million just for one appearance. So that's basically head of the party. Guardian of the economy, whenever the economy is bad, the president is expected to do something about it. We often don't see the president acting directly, but sometimes you do. Like, for example, when we had the crash of the housing crash and all of that, the president then sought to, this was President Bush, sought to improve the economy by financing the banks. Director of public opinion means that the president gives speeches in an effort to inform the public about what's going on and to direct the public to support whatever policies he's interested in. For example, when we went to war in Iraq, when we went to war in Afghanistan, the president got on television and tried to convince the American public that this was the right thing to do. And then to some degree, the president's leader of world public opinion, since the United States is the preeminent power in the West, that essentially he does the same thing for a lot of other countries, because whenever the president gives a speech, there's a lot of people in, say, Western Europe who are paying attention to what he says, and probably more influenced than people in the United States. Here's another way of looking at the roles of the president. You can answer it from the standpoint of this kind of thing too. Crisis manager. President's a crisis manager, whether it's domestic or foreign policy. The president acts. He's a morale builder. Try to convince the republic, try to convince the public to return to normalcy after 9/11. That was an example of morale builder. People were afraid to fly. A lot of people were just driving their cars right after 9/11. So the president, he's there to kind of build morale. Probably the best example of this would have been FDR, because FDR was able to do it during the Depression, and the Depression was a pretty awful time for almost everybody, and he was trying to convince people that times were going to get better. Another thing is to recruit top officials. The president appoints leaders such as cabinet officials, and so that's his responsibility. Priority setting, that's the agenda setting that we talked about. Political coalition building. This is a really hard thing to do in our time, because the president's supposed to try to convince everybody to go along with them. That's the public and public officials. And it's very hard because of the divisions within Congress to try to get them to go along with them, especially if they're of the other party. So when you got divided government, that is, one branch of government is controlled by the Democrats and the other branch is controlled, or at least one branch like the House or the Senate, is controlled by the Republicans, like the situation you have now, both House and Senate is controlled by Republicans. It's very hard for all of them to get along, especially at this particular moment, because right now the president is lame duck. That is, he's about to leave office, and you already have the campaign going on for the next president. And so the chances of them reaching agreement is very, very slim. So you have the president goes out and he negotiates agreement with Iran to try to to get them to stop developing nuclear weapons, and the probable result would be that the Congress will not pass it because it's too political, and they're in the midst of a presidential election campaign already. And then the next one would be administration. As I said before, the president runs the executive branch. So you could look at it from the first slide that I showed, or this slide, in terms of what two roles do you think is the most important for the president. Second question is, what's meant by the president-centered government, presidency-centered government? What it means is these things that I listed here. One is the president is the most important entity of the national government. That is to say, Congress and the Supreme Court play a secondary role. It was intended by the founders, if you look at the Constitution, that Congress would be the most important branch, followed by the president, and then the Supreme Court was kind of an afterthought. But the way it really works now is the president is clearly the head of the government. And it's come out that way for a number of reasons, some of which I've listed here. Number three, the president dominates the agenda. Whatever the president wants to do, that becomes the agenda of the country. Not just his own agenda, but the agenda of Congress and the public, in public opinion, in terms of what's the most important problems and all that stuff. It's usually whatever the president is focusing on. So if the president's going to decide what's important, then that person who occupies the presidency is going to really be in a position of power, much more power than any other, either Congress or the Supreme Court. Another thing that's made the president so powerful is the president dominates foreign policy. The foreign policy is really made by the president. As a matter of fact, a Congress, which is supposed to play a major role in foreign policy, and you can include the Supreme Court in this too, that neither one of them really know what's going on. A lot of foreign policy is conducted in secret. The CIA and the Defense Department and everybody else involved around the president usually don't let Congress know. And Congress is sort of embarrassed to say they don't know what's going on, so they kind of keep their mouth shut. But the domination and the emphasis, the domination of the president in foreign policy and the domination of foreign policy as such an important component of the daily life of the president, that is, the president is probably spending more time on foreign policy than anything else, largely because we're usually involved in at least two countries right now with all this terrorism stuff going on. The president's involved in several countries because it's believed ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whoever the hell they think they're fighting are supposedly involved in Somalia, and at least I think the State Department estimated that it's about 40 countries. So there's no telling where we're at because they don't make it public. But the chances are the president's spending most of his day dealing with these foreign policy issues. And that's extended his power because he's not sharing that power with anybody. He's doing it all by himself. And then the last thing I would say here in number two, that why we have a presidency-centered government, or what it means to have a presidency-centered government, is that the public and Congress look to the president to solve problems. When anything happens, we don't look to Congress to solve it. We look to the president. Like, for example, 9/11. When you go back to 9/11, that was a major crisis in American foreign policy. And we don't say, well, what's Congress going to do about it? Or what's the Supreme Court going to do about it? No. We look at the president and we say, how is the president going to handle this problem? No matter what it is, if it's of national import, it's the president who's going to be at the center of it, and that's why we have a presidency-centered government. Okay, number three is, how can Congress limit the power of the president? I listed some things here. The president isn't all powerful, or doesn't have to be all powerful. Usually, a lot of times he is. And that's because the other branches of government, the Congress and the Supreme Court, refuse to participate. They don't exert their own power. So he gets to operate by himself. But anyway, what could they do? If they wanted to, what could they do? One is they have the power to spend money. The president does not have power to spend money. He only has power, like he can send troops somewhere. But if Congress doesn't give them the money to give the president the money to support those troops, pay for those troops, give them food and weapons and everything else, then the president has to bring them home. Now that's a difficult thing to do, to stop the money flow, because there's all this rally around the flag and everything where people get to supporting initial actions by the president in war. And it would be very, very hard. It's very hard for anybody to just stand up and say, wait a minute, do we really need to do this? Do we really need to go to war? That's a hard thing to do. And to stop the money is even harder. So whenever there's a frenzy, if you remember to 9/11, there was a tremendous frenzy, not only in the government but among the public, about how we've got to retaliate for what happened. And it kind of doesn't matter who we shoot, we just got to shoot somebody. So there's the power to spend money it's certainly there, and Congress could use it. I mean, that's the most important power they have, because money's the most important thing in the United States. And they could stop the president anytime they want by saying, look, we're not going to pay for this. And they're always saying that, at least the Republicans are, on domestic front. Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay for it, and so on. Like with Social Security or Medicare or Obamacare or anything like that, they're always saying, well, where's the money going to come from? Is this going to mean increased taxes and so on? Foreign policy, we don't pay any attention to it. Like in Iraq, we went to Iraq to make friends with millions and millions of dollars in cash. And nobody to this day can tell you where that money went. My God, what craziness this country involves itself in the name of trying to protect itself. We are one crazy country. I tell you, I'm so happy to be alive just to witness all this nonsense. Anyway, get back to the point. The power to spend money could limit the president if they chose to do it. Second, they can pass laws limiting the president. Congress can pass laws saying the president does not have the power to make war. War Powers Act is a classic example. After the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War was a major fiasco in American foreign policy, because we were supposed to train the South Vietnamese to on their own. And when we left, or were in the process of leaving, and left the fighting to them, they didn't hold up. They didn't even come close. And so the Congress said, look, we don't want this kind of thing to happen again. They passed the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act said essentially that if the president can start a war, but he has to come back in 30 days and then again in 60 days to get approval from Congress. And if Congress doesn't give him approval, then the war has to end. So that's the kind of stuff that Congress can pass, limiting the power of the president if they want to. But again, like spending the money, they don't want to. They'd rather just have the president just run the government. And then oversight is another thing, and that is to investigate. We talked about how journalists and the media can investigate the government. Well, Congress can do it too. For example, when Congress was involved in investigating the Watergate before the impeachment process began for President Nixon, or when they investigated the Monica Lewinsky case before they began to impeach President Clinton. That oversight stuff can be very important. I remember especially going back to Watergate, how the Congress was on television every afternoon. The special committee investigating the Watergate was on TV every afternoon, and it made for high drama, much better drama, more people watching Judge Judy or whatever craziness is on TV nowadays. So that's all part of the oversight function where they can investigate to find out what's going on. And then advice is the last thing. The Congress, especially the majority party in Congress, can advise the president, regardless of whether he's a Democrat or Republican, about what to do and what not to do. Okay, so here's the last question. What has President Obama done to expand the powers of the presidency in his 8 years in office? Now, he hasn't done as much as President Bush did, W I'm talking about, because W was involved with a more intensive war in Afghanistan and Iraq. But he continued doing the same kind of things. Obama continued to do the same kind of things, war powers, as President Bush. So President Bush initiated the original powers that were involved, like, for example, spying on the enemy and shooting at people who were thought to be bin Laden, and capturing prisoners and then torturing them. All of that kind of stuff was continued by President continued by President Obama. So he kind of focused his attention on the war powers that were given to him by Bush and made them even more intense. Same thing you could say about that he continued the policies with regard to immigration. I didn't mention it here, but immigration would be another example, that more people were thrown out of the country under Obama than were ever sent home by the Bush people. And that's largely, because they potentially might be terrorists, or they might be illegal or whatever. So anyway, there was a lot of that going on. Here's a major contribution to the presidency in the sense of giving it more power, is the drone wars. That President Obama decided to do drone wars, that is, to fight without troops on the ground. So you have these plane-like devices, sort of like model planes, really, with weapons on them and also cameras on them, so that somebody who's controlling it from far away can see the people on the ground or whoever they're there, and they can shoot at them. And that's the kind of thing that's been extensively done, because what's happened is President Obama said from the beginning that he was going to end the war in Iraq and end the war in Afghanistan. And he hasn't been able really to do that. So in an effort to try to make it look like he is doing that, he'll pull the troops back and then extend more war with drone wars. Because a lot of what we're doing in Afghanistan and Iraq is to attempt to do what we did in Vietnam. That is to train the locals to be able to fight for themselves and to stand up without us. And like Vietnam, it hasn't worked. So drone wars have replaced the kind of weak and ineffective soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Another thing that he's done is increase the spying on American citizens. So President Obama is really doing the same kind of things that President Bush did in terms of spying. It's just gotten worse. So when anybody who's expected of being a terrorist or associated with terrorists or anything like that, they're spied on. And we're even spying on mosques, because we think that the religious leaders or the people who are terrorists gather at mosques. So anyway, the president has increased the spying on American citizens. And then the last thing I would say is that he's increased the targeting of people to be murdered in foreign countries. See, now that we're involved in wars not against countries but against these so-called terrorist groups, now that we're involved in that kind of thing, what we're doing is we're looking for individual citizens who might be leaders of these gangs or groups that are outside the government, like ISIS or Al Qaeda, or just any group. I don't know who's coming up next, but They're looking for these people, and then they just go out and murder them. You know, it used to be in the past that we had more class than that, that the American government would, first of all, when we would go to war, we'd go to war with another country, not with a group of people within several countries. Like supposedly Al Qaeda is in 40 countries. So, you know, what are we going to do? Are we going to go to all 40 countries and try to kill these people? Um, and that's the new approach, is to try to kill the leaders. So we started with bin Laden. The president went out there and shot bin Laden. Um, and so it's almost like the president of the United States is like the head of the mafia or something, that we just pick out people and say, there's this guy over here in Somalia, and we think he's a leader of ISIS. So let's go in there with a drone and try to kill him. And so that's the kind of thing. And I'm not saying that Obama invented this policy, because it's been used before. Um, you can go back to Saddam Hussein. We tried to kill him a number of times. But it seems like it's been expanded quite a bit with the drones and with President Obama. Anyway, that's the extent of what I had to say about the fourth question. So I think we're done. I hope it helps.